This episode of The Trail Went Cold is brought to you by Murder Book, a new true crime podcast hosted by best-selling author Michael Connelly, available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Also be sure to check out Dark Sacred Night, Michael Connelly's latest #1 bestseller featuring detectives Harry Bosch and Renee Ballard. Thank you, and enjoy the show. July 16th, 1952. Salisbury, Connecticut. While attending summer camp, 10-year-old Connie Smith skips breakfast and leaves the campground. Numerous witnesses see Connie walking down the road and attempting to hitchhike, but before she reaches the nearest town, she vanishes without a trace. Over the years, there are a number of promising leads, including an anonymous letter stating that Connie is an unidentified murder victim from Arizona named Little Miss X, but the investigation fails to turn up any trace of her. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we're going to be chronicling an older missing children's case on today's episode, the 1952 disappearance of 10-year-old Connie Smith. This is the tragic story of a girl who was attending summer camp, but then made the inexplicable decision to walk away from the campground, possibly after an altercation with her fellow campers, and was never seen again. At the time, this case was a pretty big deal, because Connie hailed from a wealthy, affluent family, and her grandfather just happened to be the former governor of Wyoming, so no expense was spared in the search efforts for her. What adds an extra level of intrigue to this case is that there is an unusual mystery within a mystery. A decade after Connie went missing, police received an anonymous letter claiming that Connie was an unidentified murder victim known as Little Miss X, whose skeletal remains were found in Arizona in 1958. You'd think that proving or disproving that Connie and Little Miss X were the same person would be relatively simple, but there have been so many complications, and even if the two cases aren't connected, the story of Little Miss X is quite a rabbit hole on its own. So we're going to explore Connie Smith's disappearance and the numerous twists and turns which have ensued from it on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or a review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unsolved disappearance of Connie Smith. Our story begins in Connecticut during the summer of 1952. Our central figure is 10-year-old Connie Smith, who hails from an affluent family and lives on a sizable horse ranch in Sundance, Wyoming. Connie's parents are Peter Smith and Helen Jensen, and she has a 13-year-old brother named Nels, who was named after their paternal grandfather, Nels Hanson Smith, who served as governor of Wyoming from 1939 until 1943. Peter and Helen have been divorced since 1949, but the separation was a pretty amicable one, as Helen was allowed to live in a separate home on the Smith family's ranch. While Helen had primary custody of Connie, both parents had a significant role in her life. During the summers, Helen usually took Connie to visit her maternal grandmother in Greenwich, Connecticut, but on this particular year, Connie would be attending summer camp for the first time. The location in question would be Camp Sloane, a 250-acre YMCA camp located in the foothills of the Berkshire Mountains, just over 3 miles outside the town of Salisbury. Connie would be spending her time there inside a platform tent with bunk beds alongside 7 other girls. By the morning of Wednesday, July 16th, Connie had been at the camp for 3 weeks. At around 7:50 a.m., the campers were ready to go to the mess hall for breakfast, but Connie told her tent mates that she was going to the infirmary to return an ice pack. She had been using the ice pack on her bruised hip, which was supposedly caused by a fall off the elevated tent platform the previous evening. The other campers went to breakfast as planned, but Connie never showed up. When they returned to the tent at around 8:45, they discovered that the ice pack was still on Connie's bunk, but Connie herself was nowhere to be found. The camp director, Ernest Roberts, was soon informed about Connie's absence, and a search of the campground was performed for her. By 11:30, she had still not been found, so the Connecticut State Police was notified, and Connie was officially reported missing. Once word reached Connie's grandfather, former Governor Connie Smith, he used his influence to ensure that a full-scale search operation, both on the ground and in the air, would be conducted. This would turn out to be one of the very first missing persons cases in which posters of the victim were circulated, offering a reward for information, this time for $3,000. It soon became apparent that Connie had willingly left the campground on her own and walked a half-mile down the driveway to Indian Mountain Road, as no fewer than 9 witnesses reported seeing her shortly after she separated from her tent mates. The first of these witnesses was the camp's caretaker, who claimed he saw Connie emerging from the driveway and turning right on Indian Mountain Road and stopping to pick some daisies at 8:15 a.m. Now, it should be mentioned that Connie was already 5 feet tall and had developed earlier than normal, so she looked older than 10 years old. The caretaker would state that Connie looked tall enough and old enough to be one of the camp counselors, so he did not have any concern about her leaving the camp and walking down the road alone. After this, a couple out for a morning walk claimed they passed Connie about a quarter mile from the camp's entrance, but they didn't speak to her. It wasn't long before Connie knocked on the door of a nearby house, which was answered by a housewife named Alice Walsh. She claimed that Connie asked for directions to Lakeville, a small village which was part of the town of Salisbury and located just under 2 miles northeast of the camp. Walsh provided the directions, but said that Connie looked like she had recently been crying. A few minutes later, a pair of maids sitting outside a servant's cottage at another residence on Indian Mountain Road also said that Connie approached them and asked for directions to Lakeville. The maids told her to keep walking and turn right on Route 44. The next sighting of Connie took place on Route 44 when a couple drove past her. They said she appeared to be sticking out her thumb and attempting to hitchhike, but they did not stop. At around 8:45, another motorist would see Connie walking along Route 44 near the intersection of Belgo Road, but this would turn out to be the last time she was confirmed to be alive. This location was about a half-mile outside of Lakeville, but even though residents and business owners from the village were extensively questioned, none of them could recall seeing Connie that morning. It seemed apparent that something had happened to Connie before she made it to Lakeville, but even though Route 44 usually had heavy traffic, no one saw anything. Upon learning of Connie's disappearance, her parents, Peter Smith and Helen Jensen, immediately traveled to Salisbury and were actively involved in the search efforts for her. In spite of their divorce, there was no reason to suspect that either of the parents had any knowledge or involvement in their daughter's disappearance. Given the family's wealth, there was some speculation that Connie may have been kidnapped for ransom, but no ransom demand ever arrived. Peter personally chartered and flew a plane over the area to search for Connie, and was described by the locals as the Marlboro Man, since he was a 6'7" cowboy with a 10-gallon hat, who often rode horses through the forests to look for his daughter. The one thing which no one could understand is why Connie walked away from Camp Sloane to begin with, as she was not carrying any money and had left behind her extra clothing and belongings. July the 11th just happened to be Connie's 10th birthday, so her mother and maternal grandmother went to visit her at the camp 2 days later. According to Helen, Connie appeared to be in good spirits and was looking forward to the upcoming weekend because there was a square dance and horse show she wanted to attend. Connie even asked her mother if she could stay at the camp a little longer than planned, even though Helen said no, because she had already arranged Connie's trip back home to Wyoming. Connie didn't seem to mind. Since the children at the camp were not allowed to carry money, Helen deposited $5 in Connie's camp account, which could be used for future purchases. A half-written letter was also found in Connie's belongings, where she described what a wonderful time she was having at camp, but it was unfinished. However, one camp official would recall seeing Connie crying right after her mother and grandmother left, and there were hints that she was very homesick, and things were not as good for her at camp as she let on. In addition to her bruised hip from the night before, Connie suffered another injury on the morning of her disappearance, which left her with a bloody nose and broke her eyeglasses. Since Connie was very nearsighted, she really could not see much at all without her glasses. The official story was that Connie's bloody nose and broken glasses were caused when one of her tent mates accidentally kicked her in the face while climbing out of her bunk. However, there were rumors that this may have actually been the result of a violent altercation and that Connie did not get along well with most of her tent mates. Since Connie was raised on a horse ranch and was known for being a tomboy, and many of the other girls hailed from New York City, there may have been a cultural divide which caused them to clash. Camp Sloane did have a telephone, but officials discouraged the children from using it. This created speculation that a violent altercation may have prompted Connie to decide she wanted to go home, so she walked away from the camp and was heading towards Lakeville in order to find a payphone to call her mother to come pick her up. Anyway, investigators pursued quite a few ridiculous leads in search of Connie. For example, there was a gypsy encampment located near Camp Sloane, so officers from the Connecticut State Police would hide in the forest for several days to watch over the encampment to see if Connie had been kidnapped and was being held there against her will, but there was no sign of her. But one ridiculous lead took the cake, and I'll say this right up front. What I'm about to say here might be the goofiest thing I've ever shared on this podcast. Believe it or not, a so-called telepathic psychic horse named Lady Wonder was brought in to assist the investigation. Whenever Lady Wonder was asked a question, she would answer it by using her snout on a lever to flip up alphabet cards on a giant keyboard. No, seriously. Lady Wonder was a popular attraction during this time period, and in the months prior to Connie's disappearance, she apparently once provided information which helped police find the body of a missing Massachusetts boy. So the horse was asked questions about what happened to Connie Smith, and she apparently spelled out Los Angeles. Well, Peter Smith was desperate to try anything, so he traveled to Los Angeles to search for Connie, but shocker of all shockers, this lead went nowhere. Regardless, Peter used his time in LA to book an appearance on the popular TV show Art Linkletter's House Party, which gave his missing daughter's case national exposure. However, because of the extensive publicity, there would be a number of false tips, sightings, and confessions over the years. One of the most infamous false confessions involved a death row inmate named George Davies, who was incarcerated at Connecticut's Wethersfield State Prison for the murders of 2 girls. In 1959, Davies confessed that he had been responsible for the murder of Connie Smith and offered to lead investigators to a spot near the Naugatuck River where he claimed he buried her remains. When police took Davies to the location, they did not find anything. But right before he was executed in the electric chair, Davies finally admitted that he had lied about murdering Connie and only made up the story so that he would have an opportunity to leave his prison cell and spend some time outdoors in the sunshine. Another unusual tip took place in 1955 when a Connecticut state trooper named Leo Turcotte received a phone call from a man calling himself William Dugan, who claimed he was a former carnival worker and had information about the disappearance of Connie Smith. Dugan said he was calling from Montreal and wanted to arrange a meeting with Turcotte to share everything he knew. Well, Turcotte's commanding officer ultimately decided that he wanted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to pursue this tip and turn it over to them. Turcotte had no idea what became of this lead, but a light bulb went on over his head 33 years later when he learned about the arrest of a suspect named William Henry Redmond. In April of 1951, an 8-year-old girl named Jane Marie Althoff was strangled to death while attending a carnival in Trainer, Pennsylvania. Fingerprints from the murder scene were eventually matched to William Henry Redmond, a Ferris wheel operator with a record for child molestation, and a warrant was issued for his arrest, but for over 3 decades, police could not find him. But Redmond was eventually tracked down to Nebraska and charged with murder in January of 1988. After hearing about this in the news, Leo Turcotte suddenly remembered the phone call he had received in 1955 and wondered if perhaps William Dugan might have been Redmond, so he notified the authorities. While in a prison hospital awaiting trial, Redmond allegedly told a fellow inmate that he was responsible for the murders of 3 other girls besides Jane Marie Altoff. Redmond was questioned about the disappearance of Connie Smith, but denied being responsible and passed a polygraph. Since Redmond was 66 years old by this point and suffering from heart disease and emphysema, it was ultimately decided that he was too ill to stand trial for Jane Marie Altoff's murder. He died in 1992, but investigators were unable to find any link between him and Connie or place him in the Connecticut area at the time she went missing. Another individual who popped up on the radar as a suspect was a traveling jewelry salesman from Indianapolis named Frederick Pope. In April of 1953, Pope walked into an Ohio police station and confessed to being involved in the murder of Connie Smith. According to Pope, he had been driving along Route 44 with an accomplice named Jack Walker when they picked up Connie hitchhiking and promised her a ride all the way back to her home in Wyoming. Later on, when Connie complained that they weren't taking the right route, Walker responded by murdering her. Pope and Walker subsequently buried Connie's body near a highway in Arizona, but the 2 men later got into an argument, which led to Pope beating Walker to death with a tire iron and burying his body. Well, upon closer scrutiny, Pope's story completely fell apart. It turned out that 4 years earlier, Pope had confessed to killing and burying another man in Los Angeles, but this story turned out not to be true, and authorities began to suspect that Jack Walker did not actually exist. Pope finally admitted that the entire story about Connie's murder was a hoax, and that he only made it up because he had a history of mental issues and wanted to be committed to a hospital. But oddly enough, there would eventually be another intriguing lead in this case, which linked Connie to Arizona. On October 31st, 1958, a pair of deer hunters found the skeletal remains of a young girl on Skinner Ridge, a hillside off a dirt road in Coconino County, Arizona. The location was near the town of Williams and about 10 miles southeast of the Grand Canyon. The victim was believed to have been either white or Hispanic and between 11 and 17 years old, and it was estimated that she had been deceased for around 9 to 18 months. Since the victim could not be identified, she was given the nickname Little Miss X. Little Miss X was unclothed when she was found, but clothing would be found in the area a short time later. The clothing included a white wool cardigan sweater and brown capri pants, but oddly enough, it appeared to be too big to have belonged to the victim. Other items found near the scene included a comb, a jar of Pond's cold cream, and a blue plastic nail file case which had the letters P and R engraved on them. Well, there was speculation that this nail file case might have belonged to Donis Redmond, a 14-year-old girl from San Pedro, California, who went by the nickname Pinky. Earlier that year, Pinky and her 18-year-old boyfriend, Michael Griffin, had traveled to Las Vegas to elope and were last seen on March the 1st. They both vanished without a trace, but Michael's car would be found abandoned in the town of Williams, not too far from where Little Miss X's remains were discovered. Since Pinky was last seen wearing a yellow sweater and brown capri pants, there was speculation that she might have been Little Miss X, but she was eventually excluded. Well, the case took an interesting turn in 1962 when the Connecticut State Police received an anonymous letter from Colorado claiming that Connie Smith was Little Miss X. As a result, the victim's remains were exhumed, and her skull was taken to the Smith Ranch in Wyoming so that her family dentist could compare her teeth with Connie's dental records. The results were inconclusive, so the skull was subsequently taken to Denver to be examined by a team of forensic experts. A dental surgeon and a pathologist both concluded that the skull probably did not belong to Connie and it was subsequently reburied. However, given that technology has advanced so much in 5 decades, there has been speculation that this conclusion may have been a mistake. Little Miss X had 4 fillings in her teeth, and according to Connie's dentist, 3 of them were pretty identical to fillings he had given her. There has been a lot of debate about a small indentation found in Little Miss X's palate. The experts from Denver seem to believe the indentation was naturally occurring, but Connie's dentist thought it may have been the result of the surgical removal of an extra tooth known as a supernumerary tooth, as Connie did have one removed before she went missing. In recent years, dental experts have taken a fresh look at Little Miss X's dental charts and compared them to Connie's records, but cannot conclusively say with 100% certainty whether or not they belong to the same person. Well, the Smith family wanted a more conclusive answer to this, So in 2004, Connie's surviving relatives agreed to submit DNA samples to the Connecticut State Police in order to compare them to Little Miss X. But there turned out to be a major problem. Little Miss X's remains could no longer be found. She was buried in the county section of Citizen Cemetery in Flagstaff, Arizona, but the issue is that the section has no gravestones or markers and is nothing but a wide open field. A number of deceased people are buried there, but after all these years, there are no longer any records to determine the exact spot where Little Miss X is buried, making it impossible to exhume her remains for DNA testing. Anyway, Connie's family never stopped hoping that they would receive answers someday. Her mother, Helen, believed that the best-case scenario was that Connie's injuries from the camp were much worse than expected, causing her to develop amnesia and wander off. She clung to the hope that Connie might still be alive somewhere, but tragically, Helen succumbed to a heart attack in 1962 at the age of 47, and many would say that she died from a broken heart. On the other hand, Peter Smith was relentless in his pursuit of his daughter and continued returning to the Salisbury area to look for her as late as the 1980s. He once stated in an interview that as the years went on, he imagined his daughter in the face of every woman he passed by who would have been her age. Peter managed to live to the age of 97 before he passed away in 2012. Now, Connie's older brother, Nels Jensen Smith, is still alive today at the age of 80, and much like his grandfather, has had a successful political career, which included serving as Speaker of the Wyoming House of Representatives. Nels was interviewed in an extensive two-part article published in the Register-Citizen this past August, and he expressed his belief that Connie might be Little Miss X. In that same article, the Coconino County Sheriff's Office announced that they believe they may have figured out the exact spot in Citizen Cemetery where Little Miss X is buried. Once they piece everything together and make a conclusive determination, they plan to exhume Little Miss X's remains and finally extract her DNA. But until this occurs, she will remain an unidentified Jane Doe, and the disappearance of Connie Smith continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to send out a special thanks to Murder Book, the new true crime podcast hosted by best-selling author Michael Connelly, as we are very excited that they are now supporting The Trail Went Cold. Returning to his roots as a journalist, Michael Connelly is now working with the very detectives who inform his novels and his hit television show Bosch in order to deliver a podcast which explores real homicide cases not covered by the mainstream media. Murder Book Season 1 is titled The Telltale Bullet, and it dives into a 30-year-old Hollywood carjacking gone wrong, which tests the limits of the American criminal justice system. And we would also like to recommend Dark Sacred Night, the latest #1 bestseller from Michael Connelly, which features detectives Harry Bosch and Renee Ballard teaming up together to investigate the unsolved murder of a 15-year-old female runaway. Michael Connelly is the best-selling author of 32 novels and has sold over 74 million books worldwide. I've been a big fan of his ever since I read The Lincoln Lawyer many years ago, and Dark Sacred Night measures up to his usual high standards. It's great to see one of the author's most iconic characters, Harry Bosch, team up for the first time with Detective Renee Ballard, a brand new protagonist who was introduced in Mr. Connelly's previous novel, The Late Show, and the writing of these two characters is so strong that they wind up being the perfect match for each other. You can find Dark Sacred Night wherever books are sold. I'm also greatly looking forward to the Murder Book podcast, particularly due to its promise to explore lesser-known cases which have not gotten a lot of coverage in the mainstream media, which is the same philosophy we like to employ here at The Trail Went Cold. I look forward to listening to them educate me about some true crime stories which I am not familiar with. So be sure to check out Michael Connelly's new Murder Book podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can go directly to the website murderbookpodcast.com. That's murderbookpodcast.com. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the episode. So this is one of those missing persons cases where the explanation for what actually happened to the victim seems pretty obvious. Since Connie was last seen attempting to hitchhike on Route 44, it's likely that she was picked up by an unknown person who did her harm, and unfortunately, this happened to take place during a very narrow window of time when no one else was around. If Connie was taken away in a vehicle, then she could have been murdered at an entirely different location outside the search area, which is why no one has ever found her. But even so, there are still a lot of unanswered questions about the circumstances of why Connie wound up in this situation to begin with, and the case also has a number of interesting side stories which may or may not be connected. In missing children's cases, it's always frustrating when the victim is last seen at a location they had no reason to be at. One of the most famous examples of this is a case I previously covered on the podcast, The Disappearance of Aisha Degree, where a child inexplicably left her home in the middle of the night and was last seen walking down the road by motorists before she vanished. The circumstances here are a bit similar, except that it's not hard to come up with a logical reason why Connie may have wanted to walk away from Camp Sloane. In the preceding 12 hours or so, she suffered a bruised hip, a bloody nose, and broken eyeglasses, and while the official story is that these incidents were purely accidental, there are a number of people who suspect that Connie was being violently bullied and just decided that enough was enough. It's really hard to get a handle on what exactly happened with Connie before she left the camp, as almost no details have ever been released publicly about the other girls she was sharing a tent with. And that's understandable since they were all minors and deserved to have their names kept private. But it's easy to come up with reasons why there might have been some friction, especially when you consider that this was the first time Connie had ever attended summer camp, and she had probably never spent this much time away from her family before. Like I mentioned earlier, all of these other girls came from the big city, whereas Connie came from a wealthy, privileged family who lived on a large ranch, and she had a more tomboyish personality. You also have to factor in that Connie was quite tall for her age and had developed earlier than normal at age 10, so you can see why she might have been an ideal target for a group of bullying mean girls. It's interesting how Connie gave her mother and grandmother the impression that she was having such a great time at camp, but it's possible she was just putting on a happy face to avoid worrying them, especially since Connie was reportedly seen crying right after they left during their last visit. And of course, Alice Walsh would report that Connie appeared to have been crying when she gave her directions to Lakeville on the morning she disappeared. If Connie's eyeglasses were broken intentionally by her tent mates, then I'm guessing this would have been her breaking point, since it sounds like she could barely see anything at all without them. Since the kids were discouraged from using the telephone at the camp, it seems pretty believable that Connie was heading into Lakeville in order to find a payphone to call her mother and planned to ask her to come pick her up and take her home. But I also cannot overlook the fact that Connie was only about a half-mile outside of Lakeville when she was seen sticking her thumb out. Given that she had already walked nearly a mile and a half by this point, it is a bit odd that she would elect to hitchhike when she was such a short distance away. Furthermore, she knocked on Alice Walsh's front door to ask for directions to Lakeville, so if Connie was planning to call her mother, she could have conceivably asked Walsh if she could use her phone at the house, rather than finding a payphone in town. This is what makes me wonder if perhaps Connie was hitchhiking in hopes that someone would give her a ride all the way to her grandmother's house in Greenwich, as it was located about 80 miles south, and her mother was spending the summer there. But on the other hand, Connie did leave all her extra clothing and belongings behind at the camp, which seems to indicate that she was planning to return there at some point. Now, I should mention that there's been some speculation that Camp Sloane orchestrated some sort of cover-up, especially since the camp director, Ernest Roberts, had a bit of a shady history. The camp was once implicated in a scandal after an 11-year-old boy died there in 1940 after contracting septicemia. Well, it turned out the camp's doctor at that time was not licensed to practice medicine, and since Roberts knew about this, he was arrested and received a fine. In spite of the scandal, Roberts was still working as the camp's director in 1952 and known for being very protective of his camp's image. Since Connie was first noticed to be missing at around 8:45, and Roberts did not notify the police for nearly 3 hours, one theory I've seen presented is that Connie's bullying at the hands of her tent mates escalated so out of control that she wound up dead, so everyone involved covered the whole thing up by hiding her body. But I don't find this plausible at all. we have no fewer than 9 eyewitnesses placing Connie outside Camp Sloane on Indian Mountain Road and Route 44 at the exact same time the other campers would have been in the mess hall having breakfast, so she clearly left of her own volition. While Connie's tent mates may have done something to compel her to walk away from the campground, they clearly had no direct involvement in her actual disappearance. Another theory I've seen pushed forward is that Connie was being molested by someone who worked at the camp, which is why she appeared to be so upset that morning. Of course, that's certainly not impossible, but no evidence was ever found to support this. The fact of the matter is that the last confirmed sighting of Connie occurred on Route 44, a half-mile away outside of Lakeville at 8:45 a.m., but even though the village was a pretty busy place that time of the morning, because a number of people were opening up their businesses, none of them remembered seeing Connie. So it's very likely that an unknown motorist picked up Connie before she made it to Lakeville. Another sad detail about this case is that many of the witnesses who saw or interacted with Connie after she left the camp have expressed regret that they didn't do more to assist her. They pretty much all mistakenly assumed that Connie was a teenager and were genuinely surprised to learn she was only 10 years old. It probably should have been a major warning sign to see a 10-year-old hitchhiking, but from a brief glance at her, the witnesses probably thought she was old enough to fend for herself. And you have to consider that 1952 was simply a much different time, and a young girl being abducted or murdered while walking alone down a country road on a sunny morning was just not a thought which popped into most people's heads back then. Whatever happened, it sounds like there was no lack of effort to find Connie, and I imagine that if a disappearance like this took place today, involving a girl from an affluent family whose grandfather was a former governor, it would be all over the media non-stop. Since Connie's parents were divorced during a time period when that sort of thing was a lot more uncommon, there was some initial speculation that one parent may have kidnapped Connie to keep her away from the other. But that theory doesn't make sense in this case at all, since the Smiths' divorce was amicable, and both parents got to live on the same property and see Connie whenever they wanted. The ransom kidnapping theory also doesn't work, as it's very unlikely anyone could have predicted Connie would leave the camp and be walking down the road alone on that particular morning. No, this definitely seems like a crime of opportunity from a predator, so let's look at possible suspects. I guess the most prominent one is William Henry Redmond, who we know already murdered one girl the year before Connie went missing, and allegedly confessed to killing at least 3 more girls which were never linked to him. Redmond has been looked at as a possible suspect in numerous cold cases from the 1950s involving young girls, including the unsolved 1951 disappearance of 10-year-old Beverly Potts, who vanished while attending a summer festival at a park in Cleveland. Redmond did have a nomadic lifestyle as a carnival worker during this time period, a profession which allowed him to travel to different states and be in the company of potential victims to prey on. However, it's worth noting that by the time Connie disappeared, Redmond was already a wanted fugitive for the murder of Jane Marie Althoff, and no one could find him until he was tracked down in Nebraska over 3 decades later. So they've never been able to determine if Redmond could have been in Connecticut in 1952. The only reason Redmond even popped up on the radar as a potential suspect to begin with was because of the state trooper, Leo Turcotte, remembering an odd phone call he received from a man named William Dugan, who said he was a former carnival worker who had information about Connie's disappearance. It's pretty amazing that Turcotte was able to remember this phone call nearly 33 years later, so kudos to him, but other than the former carnival worker connection, there really isn't much else to suggest that Redmond might have been the mysterious William Dugan. I would not be surprised at all if Redmond really was responsible for the murders of 3 other girls, but there really isn't anything to conclusively prove or disprove that he crossed paths with Connie, and the connection to him is tenuous at best. It is unfortunate that Redmond was already seriously ill by the time he was arrested, as this may have prevented information about additional crimes he committed from surfacing. Now, one lead involving a potential suspect which turned out to be a hoax was the confession by Frederick Pope, who claimed that he and an accomplice, Jack Walker, picked up Connie hitchhiking before Walker killed her, they buried her remains, and Pope killed Walker in retaliation. While I see no reason to believe this story is true, as one instant red flag was his claim that Connie wanted to ride back home to Wyoming. Given that Wyoming is nearly 2,000 miles away from Connecticut, I find it a lot more likely that if Connie wanted to visit her parents, she would have asked for a ride to see her mother in Greenwich instead. No, it became apparent that Pope completely made the story up, and that this Jack Walker never existed. But the only reason I mentioned it again is because of the fact that Pope claimed that Connie's remains were buried in Arizona. Pope's confession took place in 1953, Little Miss X's remains were discovered in Arizona 5 years later, and the Connecticut State Police received the anonymous letter from Colorado claiming Little Miss X was Connie in 1962. And as far as I know, the writer of this letter has never been identified. The Arizona connection is probably nothing more than a coincidence, and I know that Connie's case received a whole bunch of false tips, but the situation is pretty odd. A bunch of 10-year anniversary articles were published about Connie's case in the summer of 1962, so it's probably not surprising that the police got some new leads. But how did the letter writer know about Little Miss X? These days, online sleuths try to match up missing people and unidentified decedents all the time by looking up their profile pages at the Doe Network, but this was the pre-internet world of 1962, and Arizona and Connecticut are a great distance apart, so I wonder who might have had knowledge about both these cases, as I don't think Little Miss X got nearly as much publicity as Connie's case did. So now we have to talk more about Little Miss X, which is quite an interesting unsolved mystery in its own right. For starters, I'm going to express my skepticism that Little Miss X and Connie are one and the same. I know there's been a lot of debate about whether the methods used to rule Connie out via dental records in 1962 were accurate, but even if you ignore all that, the facts just don't fit. Little Miss X was believed to have been dead approximately 9 to 18 months before her remains were found, but Connie had been missing for over 6 years by that point. Unless someone abducted Connie and was holding her in captivity for a few years before she was killed, it just doesn't make sense for the remains to be her, especially when you consider that Arizona is on the opposite side of the country. But the big question is, if Little Miss X isn't Connie, then who is she? Well, the most bizarre aspect of this case is that even though Little Miss X's remains were unclothed when she was found, clothing suddenly showed up near the scene at a later time. On the surface, it appears like the clothing was planted there, and even if you believe investigators might have simply missed it when they initially searched the scene, the clothes still appeared to be way too big for Little Miss X, and probably did not belong to her. So now we have to seg into our third unsolved cold case on this episode, the disappearances of Michael Griffin and Donis Pinky Redmond. They went missing 8 months before Little Miss X was found, and man, I really wish there was more information out there about this one. The only sources I could find are the profile pages at the Charlie Project and the Doe Network, which only have brief summaries and leave me with so many questions. There are good reasons to believe there might be a connection to the Little Miss X case. A nail file case with the initials PR, Pinky Redmond, was found near the scene. The clothing Pinky was last seen wearing seems similar to the clothes which were found, and Michael's abandoned car was discovered in the nearby town of Williams. Little Miss X's profile page at the Doe Network says that Pinky was excluded as being her, but it doesn't specify how they determined that, especially since they've been unable to find Little Miss X's remains and extract DNA from her. But I think they probably came to that conclusion based on the fact that Little Miss X had reddish-brown hair and may have been Hispanic, whereas Pinky was pale-skinned and had strawberry blonde hair. However, if the clothing and nail file case found near Little Miss X's murder scene did belong to Pinky, then I have to believe the cases are connected, because it would otherwise be a massive coincidence that evidence from 2 separate crimes would be disposed of in that same remote area. Though perhaps an alternate explanation is that whoever was responsible for Pinky's disappearance learned about the discovery of Little Miss X in the papers, and then decided to plant Pinky's items at the scene, hoping that investigators would automatically assume they belonged to Little Miss X. It's possible that Little Miss X, Pinky Redmond, and Michael Griffin were all murdered by the same person, but since Michael was never found, for all we know, he could have killed the 2 females and then went on the run. But without more information about Michael and Pinky's cases, I can't make any conclusions. This whole side story involving Little Miss X, Pinky, and Michael is a pretty intriguing mystery within a mystery, but I ultimately feel that none of this has any connection to Connie's disappearance. All that being said, It sounds like investigators from the Coconino County Sheriff's Office are making a concerted effort to find Little Miss X's burial spot and recover her remains, and I definitely hope they're successful and are able to extract some DNA. Even though I don't believe she is Connie, at least DNA testing will give us a conclusive answer. And if she isn't Connie, Little Miss X is still a murdered child who has gone unclaimed for 60 years, and extracting her DNA will go a long way at helping her get her name back. So let's get back to discussing Connie. Sadly, like I said before, I think the truth about what happened to her is very simple. She crossed paths with a motorist on Route 44 who picked her up before she made it to Lakeville and ultimately harmed her after they drove away from the scene. I've seen some people push forward the theory that Connie could have accidentally been hit by a car and whoever was responsible took her body away from the scene and disposed of it before they were discovered, but I have my doubts this would have occurred without leaving any evidence behind or anyone seeing anything, so I think Connie voluntarily climbed into a vehicle with someone who pulled over to give her a ride. In 2010, author Michael C. Dooling published a book titled Clueless in New England, which not only covered Connie's case, but the 1946 disappearance of 18-year-old Paula Jean Weldon from Bennington, Vermont, and the 1936 disappearance and death of 22-year-old Catherine Hall from Lebanon Springs, New York. Since all three victims disappeared while hitchhiking, Dooling examines the possibility that they were all murdered by the same killer, though I have my doubts, considering the geographical and time differences. But I would not be surprised at all if Connie was specifically targeted by a predator who was under the mistaken impression that she was a teenager. Given how extensively the area surrounding Camp Sloane was searched at the time, it would not surprise me at all if Connie's body was disposed of at a location which was a great distance away. Sadly, there is no hard evidence pointing towards a specific suspect, so the person responsible could have just been passing through the area and was long gone by the time Connie was reported missing. The big mystery in this case will always be why Connie walked away from the camp to begin with, but it was probably just a combination of her being bullied or feeling homesick, and it was just a tragic, unfortunate coincidence that this ultimately led to her being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong person. But the good news is that even though over 76 years have passed, law enforcement has not given up on trying to solve this case, as evidenced by the extensive two-part article published in the Register Citizen this past summer. So if by chance you happen to have any information on the disappearance of Connie Smith, or you happen to know anything about the identity of Little Miss X, or the unsolved disappearances of Donis Pinky Redmond and Michael Griffin for that matter, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you have a moment, please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've already produced some exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this month, we've released an episode about another case which was featured as a final appeal segment on Unsolved Mysteries, the controversial conviction of Larry Race for the murder of his wife, Debbie Race. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.